Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is a story about what if Deku had a healing quirk. If you guys enjoy this movie, comment down below and let me know before I start. Please do support for more awesome content. And leave a like and don't forget to subscribe to my channel and also share this video with your friends and check out the description in my playlist. The author of the story 𝐀𝐦 𝐍𝐭 𝐖𝐻. So let's start the video. Izuku had an odd life, to say the least. When he was a kid, his quirk came in late. He had been expecting his father's fire breath or his mother's telekinesis. What he hadn't expected was to have a healing quirk. His mother had been so confused she'd taken an ancestry test and then went to find their old records to check their quirks. Eventually she'd found someone had a minor healing quirk and later, through quirk therapy, determined Izuku's quirk had evolved to be powerful. They hadn't known it until his father had fractured his wrist and Izuku had healed it within seconds. When the family brought it up in quirk therapy, they ran more tests and found out exactly how the boy's quirk worked. Izuku, unlike many other healers, uses his own energy to heal people. Since his quirk doesn't depend on other people's energies, bigger wounds could be healed easier. Of course, every quirk comes with its drawbacks. Izuku's drawbacks include major fatigue and pain. For example, when the boy had healed his father's fractured wrist, his own wrist began to hurt for the next couple of hours. He didn't get the injuries themselves, just the pain for a certain amount of time, and even now, Izuku didn't know if that was worse or not. When he was 8, his mother had died. Izuku didn't know what happened. He only remembered getting picked up from school by his distraught father before being taken to a strange place. Later, he'd learned this was a bar. There, he met Shigaraki Tamura, a 14-year-old boy with shaggy blue hair and crimson red eyes. He was tall, at least tall to Izuku, and the teen also seemed to have dry skin. Later, Izuku learned it was due to his quirk, decay. Izuku's dad explained the boy should call this teen Tamura as Izuku and he were brothers. Shortly after Midoriya Izuku became no more, it was Shigaraki Izuku. By the time Izuku was 10, he no longer had his mother's green hair. It had turned white. He had been tempted to dye it, but his father was completely against it. When Izuku was 12, he learned the truth about his family. He learned his father was a villain, the villain of villains, all for one. He'd learned Tamura was a kid he'd saved from the streets and became his successor. Then, Izuku learned the horrible truth of his mother's death. His father burned her alive. Perhaps that's why he could no longer look Izuku in his eyes or why he didn't allow Izuku to dye his hair. Because it'd be staring his crime, his victim, in the face. Needless to say, Izuku didn't care much for his father anymore, especially when Izuku had been forced into online schooling to keep the authorities from finding his father. On top of everything his father had already done, Izuku became the League of Villains analyst and healer. Of course, Izuku had no problem healing anyone. It's what his quirk was made for. But his father had also attempted to have his injuries from All Might be healed. Izuku's quirk was powerful, he knew that. If the formerly green-haired boy were older, perhaps in his 20s, he could do it. But he had been 10 at the time, then 11, then 12, then 13, and now again at 14. After years of exhausting himself, years of training his quirk, technique, mind, and even body, All for One continued to say he needs to get better. Tamura was at least a good big brother. When All for One wasn't around, at least. Izuku was on his way to turn 16 when the League of Villains expanded. Now the main force consisted of 6 people. Twice, or Jin, a man who could duplicate others with a clone as long as he knew their measurements, who had a clear identity disorder. He was nice enough. Izuku got along with him fine. Jin was a 30-year-old man and one of the LOV's father figures. At least, he was to Izuku. 𝗫𝗿, a powerful fire quirk which obviously had done some damage to the man's skin. 𝗫𝗿 had black hair that somehow defied gravity as it stood up in cyan-colored eyes. One of the older brothers of the League. Izuku had a distinct feeling 𝗫𝗿 was Endeavor's missing son. But he never brought it up. If 𝗫𝗿 left, he left for a good reason. Next was Big Sis Magni. She had a very cool magnetism quirk. She was tall with darker skin and brown hair with a red hue. She was the definition of a people person. Even her quirk suggested it. Spinner, someone with a lizard mutant type quirk who was obsessed with Stain, even down to his costume. Izuku had been the same way with All Might. Had his father not been his arch nemesis, Izuku would still probably idolize the man. Perhaps that's why Spinner and Izuku got along so well. Finally, out of the new recruits at least, Toga Himiko, a blonde girl with a diet of blood. Her quirk always fascinated Izuku. Toga can turn into someone after consuming their blood, and later it was revealed she could use their quirks if she cared about the person enough. Along with her quirk being interesting, Toga was also Izuku's age. Well, technically she was older, but close enough. They'd grown close the past couple of months she'd been here. And in that time Toga's learned of his complicated life. He even confided in her he wanted to be a hero. Of course, that childhood dream of his would never happen. Toga confided she had wanted to be a hero too, but her quirk wasn't cut out for it. She did like to dance though. Toga, quirks don't define who you are or what you do. Izuku would tell her, but the blonde never gave a response. It wasn't until June Toga had actually talked to him about the topic. Izuku. She'd come into his room that also doubled as the League's infirmary and sat on his small bed while he sat at his desk. Izuku had been working on schoolwork when she came in. Toga was never usually this docile, so Izuku logged out of his class and turned his full attention on her. Yes, Himiko. They'd been on a first-name basis for about a week. The two teens in the League are bound to get close after all. The girl wrung her hands as she cautiously looked over at the door before speaking. You said my quirk doesn't define who or what I am, right? Izuku nodded and Himiko took a deep breath before speaking again. Though her voice was much quieter this time, I still want to be a hero, and the younger teen felt himself smile. Then do it, Himiko. Turn yourself into custody and they can put you in a rehabilitation program, where you can hide your identity and start new. Himiko looked up at the white-haired teen's words. I have a plan for both of us. This was news to Izuku and he quickly looked towards his door to check no one was outside it. We have a US student here ... and Izuku stood up in alarm. He'd been forced to stay in his room the past couple of days, but he didn't know why. Guess they always have wanted to keep him out of view of any heroes. Please just listen to me, Izuku. Himiko was his first friend since he'd been taken away from society, and he could tell how much she wanted this plan of hers to work by the tone in her voice. Okay, continue. His voice was quiet now. Both of their voices were. Himiko took another breath and another quick glance to the door had her talking again. The heroes are going to come for him. Once they come for him, then we can surrender. We could go to your dream school. Maybe have more friends. The girl sounded so desperate. And it was new to Izuku, so despite his anxiety. Okay, Himiko looked up, eyes wide. Let's do it. Really? When Izuku nodded, the blonde girl broke into a wide smile. Izuku wasn't one to show physical affection. Not that he didn't like it, but his family wasn't one for it. This caused him to stop reaching out for hugs and other forms of affection. Himiko was the exception, as he knew she enjoyed the interaction as much as he did, if not more. So, they wrapped their arms around each other in comfort and reassurance. It was a nice moment, one that calmed both teens exceptionally. They rarely had calm moments. Tamura was always curing over hero brats and other members constantly had some issue with each other. There was always fighting and injuries Izuku would have to heal. Himiko would usually be put on babysitting duty to make sure Izuku's pain wasn't too severe. So, this nice, quiet moment was a breath of fresh air. It was quiet in the boys' room, and the blonde always gave the best hugs. Of course, as his life goes, the quiet moment turned chaotic quickly. Izuku didn't know what happened, but he did know there was a loud crash, and a lot of yelling. Check the back room. Bakugo shit. Did whoever that was say Bakugo? Was he locked in his room because the League had kidnapped his childhood friend? Izuku didn't have time to mull that particular thought over as his bedroom door was knocked off its hinges. Suddenly Wood was encasing him. We were going to surrender anyway, geez. Himiko sounded beside him, and 𝐀𝐦 𝐍𝐴 stood in the doorway with a confused look on his face. Oh my god, 𝐀𝐦 𝐍𝐴, he's so cool. Wish I would have been able to see him in action more. Or any of those villains you mentioned short with white hair. Never mind, Izuku thinks no longer cool. Seriously. He wasn't that short. There were plenty of people shorter than him, besides he wasn't even 16 yet. Surely people weren't too tall at his age. Maybe they just didn't know he was only a teen. That had to be it because he refused to believe he was short. Izuku was about to argue this point when something, most likely a quirk or one of Wood's branches, and knocked him out. When he woke up, he was in a brick room handcuffed to a metal table. A mirror, double-sided no doubt, was in the middle of the wall in front of him, and on the left a door. Izuku wasn't stupid. He knew this was an interrogation room and they had been waiting for him to wake up. What he didn't know was what exactly they were going to do with him. Yes, he had told Himiko she'd be placed in a villain rehabilitation program, especially considering her age. But Izuku wasn't a villain. All he had done was heal the League when they got injured. He had never used his quirk to commit a crime, so he wasn't a villain. Perhaps a criminal by association, but technically he'd probably be considered a victim. After all, his father did take him after killing his mother and kept him confined to the base. The teen was broken out of his train of thoughts by the door opening and the detective walking in. Good evening, I'm Detective 𝐶𝐿. I will be recording this interview. Is that all right? The man was tall, with unkempt hair and tired eyes. That's fine. Izuku's voice was raspy from his unexpected nap. The detective looked conflicted before talking again. Would you like some water before we begin the interview? Izuku would like some water, but he'd much rather get the interview over with. Thank you, but if it's okay, I'd rather get the interview over with. The detective seemed conflicted over the teen's words, but nodded nonetheless. The detective pulled out a device, most likely to record their conversation, and set it on the table before pressing play. As I've stated, I'm Detective 𝐶𝐿. My quirk allows me to determine if you're lying or not. Please state your name, quirk, and age. The detective looked at him expectantly as Izuku cleared his throat. My name is Shigaraki Izuku. However, legally, it's Midoriya Izuku. The detective's eyes widened. He wasn't sure which of his names caused the surprise. I am going to be 16 come July, and my quirk is called First Aid. Can you explain what your quirk is? Honestly, with how rare healing quirks were, Izuku wasn't surprised at the detective's question. Even when he was little and his quirk was still growing, people were always very curious. With their curiosity came possessiveness. Everyone wanted their own personal healer. Sure, Izuku sighed. If someone has an injury and I touch them, my energy heals their wounds. I get fatigued after healing too much, and a lot of the time I get pain from the injury. For example, if I healed a black eye, one of my eyes would be tender for the next couple of hours. How long have you been with the league? The man seemed concerned. Izuku wasn't sure why. It could be because it's clear Izuku was in high school, or perhaps the detective knew the story behind the Midoriya family name. Either way, Izuku supposed there could be reason for concern. Since I was 8, my mother had passed away and my father pulled me out of school. He took me to the base and put me into online classes. I hadn't left the base other than to get materials for the infirmary or groceries. Izuku was already bored with the conversation, and perhaps he shouldn't be. This interview could decide where he'd end up. Perhaps he'd get lucky and be in the same place as Himiko. He hoped he would be at least. I'm sorry to hear that. The detective gave him a sympathetic look, causing Izuku to look away. The man sighed and continued. Okay, can you tell me what your duties were in the league? Did you help with their crimes? Tsukachi was writing down Izuku's answers as the interview went on, probably for easy access. Sure, I healed their injuries, obviously. I'm not professionally trained by any means, but I've been taking some medical classes online. That paired with my quirk worked out well when there were injuries. I also did analysis for them. I didn't necessarily know what they'd use the analysis for, but most of the time I'd have ideas. For example, when they'd ask for analysis on the USJ building, I knew they were using that as a way in to kill All Might. What I didn't know were that there were other heroes and students involved. Again, Izuku was truthful. Yes, he'd done more wrong than a lot of people, but he had also not done nearly as much as others. So, in other words, your crimes are illegal quirk usage and feeding information to a villainous group knowingly. Not exactly. Like Izuku said, he didn't know the extent of what his analysis would be used for, but he isn't here to argue. Correct. Tsukachi ended the recording and started to gather his things. Thank you for answering my questions. The detective's voice trailed off as he looked at the teen expectantly. It took Izuku a moment to realize the man hadn't known which name to use. Midoriya is fine. I'd actually prefer that. The man went to leave when Izuku went to speak again. Wait. Tsukachi turned around, raising his eyebrow. Is Himiko okay? Toga. The tall man sighed and walked back over towards the teen. She's okay. We're trying to decide the best course of action for her. She is a dangerous villain, but she's only 17, so we're trying to decide what the best course of action should be. I don't suppose you could provide some insight to her? Izuku was glad he'd asked now. He knew Himiko had committed some violent crimes, but honestly it wasn't like she could control herself very well. You're aware of what her quirk is, right? Tsukachi nodded grimly, which pissed Izuku off, but he managed to keep his composure. Her quirk works by consuming people's blood. My theory is that it morphs with her own blood, which changes her DNA for a limited amount of time. When she no longer looks like the person she turned into, she loses a lot of her own blood in the process. So, she needs a constant diet of blood. Specifically type O. It's not her being a psychopath, it's malnourishment. The detective's eyes tore away from Izuku's in silent contemplation. Thank you. This is great information, and I'll be sure we keep it in mind when deciding what to do with you too. Just like that, the detective was gone and Izuku was left to contemplate his life. Kami, he really did have a strange life. One day he was coming to terms with the fact he was stuck with his odd family, and the next he's throwing them under the bus for his best friend's dreams. He supposed it didn't matter. He hadn't necessarily liked his family in a while. Izuku wonders how long it'll take before he's taken or killed. Honestly, he could see his father taking his quirk and killing him. But Izuku could also see 𝐴FO keeping him locked up for the rest of his life. Honestly, Izuku is to the point in his life he doesn't give a damn about what happens to him. Himiko though. She needs to have a life. She needs to have a chance. That's all that matters. He was positive after he explained Himiko's quirk to the detective she'd be eligible for the villain rehabilitation program at UA. Izuku was unsure about what would happen with him. Perhaps he'd be put into the same program as the blonde girl. But he'd done everything somewhat willingly. Whatever the case, maybe they'd let Himiko visit him if they did send him to Tartarus. Honestly, if I got my hands on something small and sharp, I could probably get out of these cuffs and then this room. But escaping wasn't something someone who surrendered would do, so Izuku would sit and wait for law enforcement to decide his fate. The next time the detective walks in, Izuku is half asleep and attempting to count the ceiling tiles to satisfy his boredom. The loud noise of the door slamming shut broke the white-haired teen out of his trance, and suddenly he was wide awake. "Hello again, Midoriya," the man greeted. Izuku simply nodded in his direction in acknowledgement. Tsukachi sat across from the teen before continuing. "I have discussed what we will do with Toga and you. I appreciate your patience while I figured things out. The HPSC, Nezu, and I have finally come to an agreement. Please give her a chance to prove herself." Izuku silently prayed. He didn't know what he'd do if Himiko wasn't able to have her chance. Out of the few months of knowing the blonde, he'd learned many things. One of them being that she wasn't broken, or a psycho like most had come to believe. Himiko was simply starving, and thanks to her quirk, her diet is limited. Yes, she'd done some bad stuff and it's not excusable, but it's understandable. So, if they didn't give her a chance, Izuku wouldn't mind showing them what damage a healer could really do. If they want a villain, he'd show them a villain. "We have all agreed under the circumstances surrounding your participation with the League and both of you being minors, you both can be enrolled into a villain rehabilitation program. You've saved everyone in this precinct, Detective. Good choice. There are multiple guidelines you and Toga will have to follow. For starters, you will both be fostered by a pro hero until you graduate from the rehabilitation program. You will both be at the same school, however different classes and different pro heroes will be fostering you. As far as I'm aware, the pro hero Snipe has agreed to foster you until you graduate from UA. Graduating from UA will mean you'll earn a hero license. After graduating, if you choose not to use said license, that is okay. However, that has to be until after you graduate. Okay so far." Tsukachi looked expectantly at Izuku, and the teen sighed. "Rehabilitation at UA. I'll be looked after by Snipe. Toga and I will be in different classes. We'll earn our hero licenses after graduation. Afterward, it's our choice of what to do." "Yeah, I got it." The detective looked conflicted but continued, "Nonetheless, correct. Some rules. Neither of you will be forced to have quirk suppression cuffs on you. However, that rule may be changed if you use your quirks outside of training or without permission. You both will be wearing a tracker of sorts. I want to say it'll be something small and out of the way, but I'm not entirely sure. More specific rules and guidelines will be explained later by your respective wardens. Follow me to the front of the building so we can get Toga and you to the U. A campus." Izuku wasn't exactly sure what he expected, perhaps more details for one. It seemed the detective told him the bare minimum. He'd assumed there would be more guidelines, or at least more information, considering he'd been waiting for a few hours. "Kami, what day even is it?" Izuku wasn't even sure how long he'd been out of commission when he'd been knocked out. He also wasn't sure how long he had been waiting to talk to Tsukachi again. "You coming, kid?" Izuku blinked his eyes once, then once again, and finally got up from his chair. He hadn't meant to zone out, but oh well. "Sorry, I zoned out." The white-haired teen started walking towards the door the detective was holding open. "Out of curiosity, how long have I been in custody?" As the teen made it out the door, Tsukachi closed the door behind him, silently pondering. Izuku guessed. "You got in late, Wednesday night, so I would guess about 0.28 hours. The man answered, and suddenly Izuku's aching back made more sense. "So that's why my back is killing me." "Awesome." The detective simply looked at him with sympathy before continuing to lead the way toward the front entrance. When they got to the entrance, Izuku saw Himiko and an officer standing by the door, presumably waiting for the detective. "Hello, Tsukachi. Are you the officer's?" voice was cut off by the blonde girl bolting towards Izuku. "Izuku, they wouldn't tell me if you were okay or not. You are okay, right? You didn't get a concussion, right?" Himiko was staring very intently at the teen's eyes, which the boy was used to. "I'm fine, Himi. The detective told me you were okay. Is that true?" The girl nodded and Izuku smiled. "Good. Now let's not have you run off again. You'll give most people here a heart attack." Himiko snorted and walked back over to the officer. Both men looked perplexed at what had just occurred. "We're ready. Let's get these kids to their new wardens." Tsukachi opened the door, allowing the officer to go through first, followed by Izuku. Himiko and the detective followed shortly after. There was a heavily armored vehicle outside, and something the white-haired teen hadn't noticed before they'd stepped outside the precinct. It was late. Not late as in the sun is setting, but late as in the sun had been gone for hours. An armored vehicle heading to any location in the middle of the day would seem odd. Izuku also guessed it has to do with whom the vehicle was carrying. The two teens clambered into the back of the vehicle, and almost as soon as they had sat down with the other officer, the doors slammed shut. Izuku honestly wanted to fall asleep. He hadn't slept in hours, and because of this fact, he was tempted to. But there were many things the teen didn't know, one of them being when he'd see the older teen again. "Did they tell you who your warden was?" Izuku asked, causing both the officer and his friend to look over at him. The officer, Izuku noted, looked nervous, as if the younger teen had asked Himiko to help him get out of his cuffs. "Good. Be scared, you little shit." "Yeah, Vlad King, because of the blood thing. I'm really excited. I hope he's nice. He should know what having our type of quirks are like, right?" The white-haired teen nodded, a fond smile playing on his lips. "That's great. Himiko, it's good they placed you with him. That way you won't have to be nervous about your quirk or its side effects. The short girl nodded enthusiastically and returned Izuku's previous question. What about you, Zuko? Izuku was honestly surprised when he'd found out that Snipe had been chosen for his warden. He'd half expected Recovery Girl because of the similar quirk. However, in a way it did make sense. These officers knew almost nothing about Izuku or his skills. The detective knew what the green-eyed teen had told him. Maybe more on his mother with a quirk search in the database, but other than that they knew zilch. Izuku's combat abilities, analysis abilities, and even his quirk were all mostly a mystery to these people. Again, the teen had given the basics to the detective, but there was so much more to himself than Izuku let on. Because of the mystery behind Izuku's fighting abilities, his quirk and etc., he'd been placed with a long-ranged, young pro hero. With that in mind, it made sense. Still rather odd if you look at it from a less in-depth perspective. Snipe, wonder what he'll be like. The younger teen answered the blonde girl, her responding with a curious hum. That's funny, Himiko said after a minute, causing the taller teen to smile. The officer, on the other hand, looked confused. What is? She'd asked, causing Himiko to turn towards the officer and flash a smile, sharp teeth on full display. My thoughts. Izuku always enjoyed his friend's randomness. It kept him on his toes and made for good entertainment when others, who weren't used to her antics, reacted to hearing these random thoughts. Tamura always had the best face when he was faced with the girl's odd sense of entertainment. Tamura, another ironic thing about his placement. When Izuku's brother had infiltrated the USJ, Snipe had been the only one to cause Tamura any damage. The young teen had to perform surgery on his brother to get the bullets out and then heal him so no nerves or muscle tissue would be damaged in the long run. Despite the unusual circumstances surrounding his relation to his brother, he was genuinely concerned when he returned back to the bar with multiple bullet wounds. But, as much as Izuku would hate to admit it out loud, Tamura had deserved it. Don't get him wrong, he loved and cared for his brother. Tamura had helped Izuku's injuries after training went south. The blue-haired, at the time teen, had taken care of Izuku when he was suffering from quirk exhaustion. No matter all the bad, Izuku couldn't help but still see his brother. Despite this, he'd able to admit Tamura went too far. Izuku wasn't sure how the red-eyed villain had been able to threaten students who were the same age as his brother. If I were in that class, would he have hurt me too? Of course, he would. Izuku and Tamura were brothers, united by the estranged dad that had brought them together. Regardless of their shared last name, Tamura would always be loyal to their father. Meanwhile, the green-eyed teen had gotten over wanting daddy's approval by the time he was 11. Then again, the two had very different experiences with All for One. Tamura had been ignored by heroes after his quirk manifestation had killed his family. Thankfully, Hisashi had found him. Tamura was raised like a soldier, but he'd had food, water, shelter, a bed, everything he needed to survive. Izuku, on the other hand, had been a normal kid until Hisashi killed his poor mother and raised him in isolation, simply used for the quirk he'd never really cared about. Safe to say they had different opinions on dear old dad. Izuku felt the vehicle come to a stop and Himiko, who at some point had laid her head on his shoulder, had straightened up. The back doors opened and Izuku and Himiko followed the woman outside. Once the two teens stepped outside, the younger of the two noticed they weren't at any apartment complexes. Instead, they were at UA. Standing in front of the entrance was Eraserhead Vlad King, Snipe, Present Mike, and Nedzu. There was a serious tension in the air and yet Izuku snorted. I knew Nedzu was a chimera. He turned to face Himiko, had a slight pout. Now, you owe me, the blonde groaned. Yeah, whatever, Zuko. Unfair. How was I supposed to know? The green-eyed teen was about to reply to his friend when he heard noises coming from the group of heroes. We do not need another smartass, Eraserhead groaned. Meanwhile, Nedzu wore a mischievous grin. Oh, I like you. Somehow the chimera's comment made Eraserhead look as if he'd just lost 5 years off his life. Izuku noticed the detective turn and look at him and his blonde friend, so he turned to meet the man's gaze. Go to your wardens, they'll be able to get the cuffs off. Remember to not use your quirk outside of training unless you have permission to do so, Sukachi reminded them, and the younger teen noticed Himiko roll her eyes. Izuku, not having any more energy to make a snide remark, just awkwardly grabbed his friend and led them over to their respective wardens. All right, let's get those cuffs off you, Sprout. The teen raised an eyebrow at the nickname but lifted his hands towards the hero, nonetheless. The cuffs came off shortly after and Izuku rubbed his wrists. The cuffs weren't extremely tight or anything, but they were heavy so it strained him. Thanks. The hero just nodded and Izuku looked over to see Himiko rubbing her wrists too, and suddenly looking very pale. Make sure she gets something to eat. She looks really pale, Izuku called out to his friend's warden. Vlad turned to look at him. What type is best for her? Typo, if you need a donor, you can draw some of my blood. Make sure she gets enough. Vlad looked slightly surprised but nodded. All right, might go with Midoriya and Snipe. They walked through the gates and 𝐁𝐸 kept close to the younger teen, which the teen noted made the other two pro-heroes he was with nervous. So, Midoriya, the Chimera started off after they'd been walking for a moment. How could you tell I was a chimera? Izuku looked down at the principal and began explaining. Simple. A chimera is an organism with more than one specific genotype. You have characteristics that resemble a bear and mouse. For example, your ears and paws resemble a bear's, but everything else is a characteristic of a mouse. Another grin for 𝐁𝐸, and Izuku guessed the chimera had been pleased with his deduction. Nothing else had been said on the way to what the teen would guess is the on-campus apartment, which, now that Izuku thought about it, didn't make a lot of sense. If they were heading to the apartments that the teachers stayed in, then why did the others go in a different direction? Perhaps the apartments were split up by what grade the teachers taught. Wow, little listener, good guess. Crap, I need to get that stupid muttering habit under control. Oh, thanks. Sorry, I don't mean to mutter. Habit I've had since I was a kid. He mumbled. He felt a heavy hand in his hair and looked up to see the hand belonged to Snipe. Don't worry about it, Sprout. You weren't muttering too bad, even if you were used to far worse. Izuku decided he liked Snipe. It had been a while since he hadn't been reprimanded for his habit. His older brother wasn't rude about it like a lot of other people were, but Kami forbid all for one to hear him. Another ruffle of his hair and Snipe took his hand back and led the way to the apartment once again. They got there after a few more minutes of walking, and Izuku was really hoping he could finally sleep. Once inside the building, Present Mike and 𝐁𝐸 said goodbye to the teen and his warden before leaving back in the direction they came from. The remaining hero and Izuku went up the stairs and walked down the hallway. Snipe stopped at a door labeled 9B and took out a key to unlock it. After a moment, there was a distinct click and the door swung open. Okay, kiddo. I'm assuming it's been a while since you've eaten, so let's get you fed. I'll show you to your room first, and while you settle in, I'll make some dinner. Any suggestions? I wonder if, mind making katsudon? Izuku was a little hesitant to ask. But if Snipe was able to make it, well, the white-haired teen would be very happy. That sounds great. All right, let's get you to your room. Izuku felt his face light up when they made it down the hall to the small room. There was a full-sized bed in the corner with white sheets and a dark blue comforter, a small closet on the other side of the room from the bed, and a small bookcase that currently only held 2 books. It was simple, but he really liked it, particularly the bed. There should be some clothes in the closet already. Wear whatever is comfortable. If you want to shower before eating and changing, the bathroom is right next to your room on your left. Towels are under the sink. Snipe ruffled the teen's hair for the second time that night before walking away to start dinner. Izuku looked through the closet, finding a pair of gray sweatpants and a plain white t-shirt. They looked to be his size, but even if they weren't, he didn't mind. When he'd been taken into custody, he'd been in jeans and a hoodie. The hoodie wasn't bad. The jeans were uncomfortable, though. Despite the comfort the hoodie brought, he'd been wearing it for almost 3 days and it was beginning to reek. With that in mind, he grabbed his fresh clothes and made his way to the bathroom. He'd turned on the water and waited for it to heat up a little before stepping in. The teen wasn't in the shower long. He wanted to make sure he didn't use all the hot water. After about 10 minutes, he stepped out, now clean and his curls sticking to his face. He threw on the sweatpants and shirt. The shirt was baggy, but other than that, the clothes fit fine. Izuku made his way to the kitchen, smelling the start of katsudon being cooked. Snipe was out of his hero costume, and it was then the teen realized he'd never seen the man's face before. Hey, glad the clothes fit. Dinner will be done in about 10 minutes. Mind answering some questions for me? Not interrogating you or anything, just need to know some stuff about you. The teen sat down at the counter island and nodded his head. Sure, I don't mind. Awesome. Well, first off, any food allergies? Izuku shook his head, causing the hero to smile before he continued. Good to know. So now that I see your hair is curly, are there any products you'll need for maintenance? The next few minutes went by like that. Snipe, or Sunapu as Izuku learned, asked questions and Izuku answered them to the best of his abilities. When the man had served the food, the teen decided then and there he'd die for this man. Thank you for the food. After dinner, Sunapu had Izuku help him cleaning the dishes as they talked about some rules. First off, they're implementing dorms soon. However, considering you and Toga aren't cleared for 24/7 involvement with the students, you'll still be in our care. Izuku dried the dish he was handed and placed it on the drying rack. Rules will be different for you and Toga because it depends on what your warden feels necessary. I won't lie, I'm not entirely sure just what you or Toga have done. I do know that your friend has trouble maintaining control due to her quirk, and that you haven't been physically involved with the attacks. Izuku dried another bowl as he replied. That's correct. I was the league's analyst and healer. Even then I wasn't always sure what my analysis was used for. Toga had a more direct part than I did, but she was desperate. Sunapu nods along to the teen's explanation, hanging the white-haired boy a pan. I see. Taking that into account, I think my rules will be fairly simple. You have to stay on campus and in the eyes of a hero student or a teacher. If you ever want Toga or someone else over, that's fine, but you'll need to have supervision. If you use any electronics, I'm going to check to make sure there isn't anything incriminating. Honestly, the rules were fair. The last one was unnecessary as the league didn't have any electronics other than the monitor. 𝐴 would check in on 𝐬𝐻𝑄's laptop to do school work. The monitor could only be used one way and 𝐬𝐻𝑄's laptop was strictly for school. No one touched it, not even the teen outside of schoolwork. Despite this, 𝐬𝐻𝑄 agreed and didn't complain. Trying to explain why the last was unnecessary would seem like an excuse to get back in contact with Tamura. 𝐬𝐻𝑄 already likes it here. The warden was nice. He'd be able to go to an actual school with actual teachers, and most importantly, he gets 𝐬𝐻𝑄. Suddenly the teen had remembered something important. Is Katsuki okay? The hero looked at him in confusion, so 𝐬𝐻𝑄 continued. Bakugo, the kid they kidnapped. Sanapu looked confused but replied, perfectly fine. He went to the hospital to be checked up, which he threw a fit about. 𝐬𝐻𝑄 snorted. Yup, sounds like him. Guess he hasn't changed. The hero furrowed his brows and turned to look at the green-eyed teen. You know him? 𝐬𝐻𝑄 felt his eyes water minutely as he answered. I used to. We were friends when we were little. Our mothers were close. His eyes glared through the unshed tears. That was before my mom passed and before my dad took me. He felt a heavy hand in his hair as it ruffled his curls. I'm sorry, Sprout. That must be difficult. If it makes you feel better, you'll be in class with him. Might make you feel more at ease seeing a familiar face. 𝐬𝐻𝑄 smiled up at his warden, whose hand was now off his head. Yeah, maybe. The teen's hair falls into his face, causing a frown to etch his features. He may not recognize me. My hair color is different. Sanapu looks intrigued at the information. Really? What was it before? 𝐬𝐻𝑄 smiled. It was a dark green, like my eyes. At this, Snipe chuckled. Guess Sprout is going to be a permanent nickname for you then. 𝐬𝐻𝑄 replied to Sanapu's comment with a laugh. After the dishes were all washed and put away, the teen made his way to bed. He slept good that night. Despite sleeping good, he felt exhausted in the morning. At least his back wasn't hurting anymore, and the headache was gone. Another bonus, he smelled breakfast. Looking over at the time, he saw it was 9 in the morning, which is much later than he is used to waking up. He made his way down the hall to see Sanapu cooking, the smell on miso soup filling the air. Good morning, 𝐬𝐻𝑄 greeted as he walked over to the counter. Morning, Sprout. We have an errand to run today after breakfast. The hero paused before rubbing at the back of his neck. Actually, we have multiple errands. His voice sounded guilty, and 𝐬𝐻𝑄 being 𝐬𝐻𝑄 went to put a stop to that. No need to feel guilty, I don't mind. Need any help? The hero looked relieved but shook his head. I'm okay, thanks though. His warden paused as if some realization dawned on him. I have patrol today. Shit. 𝐬𝐻𝑄 snorted and rested his chin on the counter. Why not ask someone to look over me while you're gone? Sanapu nodded, fishing some soup into some bowls for them. How do you feel about present Mike and Eraserhead? 𝐬𝐻𝑄 went to answer but paused. Realization dawned over his features before a grin broke across his face. They're married. Sanapu must have started internally panicking before 𝐬𝐻𝑄 continued because he went entirely pale. I knew it. Anytime I saw Mike on the news, he had some type of necklace outline underneath his costume. Eraserhead has a necklace underneath his capture weapon too. Good God, you're perceptive. Okay, well, if anyone asks, I didn't say shit. 𝐬𝐻𝑄 snorted at his warden's antics. I'll see if they mind keeping an eye on you. My patrol is at 2, so after breakfast go get changed. The teen nodded in agreement, and when the two got done eating, they got ready and headed out to get the errands taken care of. First, they picked up some clothes for 𝐬𝐻𝑄 to wear when not in school, and most importantly, his size. Next, they got his school uniform and some papers from 𝐁𝐸. Complete these assignments and turn them back into me, 𝐁𝐸 had said, handing the teen a thick stack of papers. Sanapu seemed oddly freaked out by this. Their last errand, they got some school supplies for 𝐬𝐻𝑄 and headed back to the apartment. The teen was putting away his clothes and school supplies while Sanapu was turning into his hero alter ego, Snipe. Hey, Sprout. 𝐬𝐻𝑄 hummed in response and turned to see Snipe standing in his doorway. Eraserhead and present Mike agreed to look after you. I got to warn you though. Warn me about being babysat by 2 heroes. Consider me intrigued. They have a son, he's your age. Eraserhead will probably be protective and untrusting. Don't expect a very warm welcome from him. 𝐬𝐻𝑄 couldn't see the man's face while Snipe was wearing his mask, but the hero's tone sounded strained. I wasn't expecting a warm welcome. The league seriously hurt him and his class. Of course he'd be hesitant for me to be about his family. The reply came easy and casual, but 𝐬𝐻𝑄 was almost nervous. Tamura and 𝐬𝐻𝑄 looked nothing alike. Tamura had deer red eyes and blue hair. 𝐬𝐻𝑄 had white head and green eyes. Their quirks were also completely different, one made for destruction, the other for healing. 𝐬𝐻𝑄 wasn't even sure if Eraserhead knew 𝐬𝐻𝑄's relation to Tamura. But, even so, Eraserhead had every right to not trust him. You seem like a good kid, Sprout. Once again, Snipe's hand found its way into 𝐬𝐻𝑄's hair. The gesture seemed so normal between the two now, yet he'd only been interacting with the hero for about 13 hours. Don't think too highly of me. I have a feeling when I officially join the class, I'm going to seem more like a villain to you. Izuku didn't mean for the words to come out bitter, but they did. Not looking forward to that day. Maybe, but maybe not. Now let's go get you to your babysitters. The teen cringed and Snipe just nodded. Yup, I heard it too. Don't worry, I am not calling them that again. The two got their shoes on and walked over to the other on-campus apartments. It was about a 20-minute walk before they got to the building. When they did, they went up to the 3rd floor and knocked on the only door on that particular hallway. It made sense. More people meant a bigger space was needed to accommodate for them. The door opened to reveal the two heroes, out of costume. Eraserhead was wearing oink sweatpants and a black long-sleeved shirt. The hero's black hair was pulled into a ponytail and despite the casual look still appeared intimidating. Something not casual about the man's appearance was the capture weapon sitting on his shoulders. It was a clear sign of mistrust. Not that Izuku blamed him. Present Mike's hair was down and his glasses sat on the bridge of his nose. A simple pair of jeans and a t-shirt replaced his normal hero costume. Present Mike, as mentioned before, had his usual glasses on, which seemed odd to the teen. Before Izuku could think too much into it, the blonde greeted the teen and his warden before inviting them inside. Sorry, I have to get to my patrol. Thank you for this though. Snipe turned towards Izuku. Be good, Sprout. The hero ruffled his hair and he was off. Come back. I don't want to be social. Alright then, little listener, come on in. Present Mike moved aside to make room for the teen to step into the apartment. Eraserhead seemed reluctant to do so, but did anyways. You lay a hand on my son and you'll be in Tartarus so quickly, Eraserhead started, but the blonde hero cut him off. Shout a stop. He seems like a sweet kid. I don't think he's even committed a violent crime before. Present Mike scolded his husband, which was slightly entertaining to Izuku. The underground hero went to argue, but thought better of it and just walked off. Sorry about him. Well, I'm Yamada and you can call that Grump Aizawa. If our son comes out of his room, you'd call him Shinsu. Yamada explained. Shinsu was probably adopted by the couple only within the last couple to have neither of their last names. Midoriya Izuku. I think you already knew that though. The blonde smiled and led Izuku into a living area shortly after the teen discarded his shoes. Make yourself at home. Sunepu's patrols usually don't last too long. He'll be back by 8, I'd say. Yamada explained and sat down next to his husband. If you're hungry, I'll be making lunch soon. Izuku, being the awkward teen he is, just sat on the floor near the coffee table. Aizawa shot him an odd look, but ultimately didn't say anything. So, Midoriya, we honestly don't know a lot about you. Mind telling us about yourself? Once again, Yamada seemed to be the one initiating conversation. Though redundant, not unexpected. What do you want to know? How about you tell us what your role was in the league? The black-haired man spoke, which was interesting to say the least. While it was unexpected for the underground hero to ask the first question, it wasn't surprising the question would be about his time with the league. Shouta Yamada began, but Izuku shrugged as if to say, no worries. Before Izuku could answer, a loud crash was heard which had all three people on alert. Itoshi, the blonde called out, heading towards the hallway, Aizawa close behind. Izuku stayed put. He wasn't sure what to do. Either way, it seemed like a lose-lose situation. If he stayed, he might get in trouble for being unsupervised. But if he followed, he may get in trouble for not following directions. Turns out he didn't need to follow them, since soon the heroes came back through with a teenager. The teen had purple eyes with gravity-defying hair to match. He was also very tall. And suddenly Izuku felt very annoyed at his short stature. How did you even do that, kid? Aizawa's gruff voice seemed concerned and exasperated. The teen, Izuku assumes is Shinsu, is holding his left forearm, which is smeared with red. I went to get something from the shelf in my room. There was a nail sticking out and Shinsu seemed to notice the shorter teen and stopped. Who's that? We'll explain later. Let's get that taken care of. The hero responded as Yamada came through with a first aid kit. Normally Izuku would offer his help, but these were trained heroes. They should know basic first aid. They did not. This was proven when Yamada started grabbing huge band-aids to place on the wound. That is the completely wrong way to dress that wound. The two heroes and the teen turned to look at him. Izuku got up and held out a hand. You are going to make that worse. Give me the first aid. Aizawa looked like he was about to tell the teen off, but Izuku cut the hero off. Kami, if you're worried I'm going to hurt your kid, just sit right there and watch. Yamada backed off and relinquished the first aid to Izuku. After examining the wound, he got to work. First, he held a towel to Shinsu's wound. You have to stop the bleeding first. Then clean, then bandage. Oh, right. Sorry, we panicked. Yamada responded, and looked over at what Izuku was doing. Not that it was necessary. Aizawa was watching him like a hawk. It's fine. If you want me to heal him instead of having him heal naturally, I can do that. But either way, bandages or a compression sleeve would be necessary. Izuku started cleaning the wound now, finally having gotten the bleeding to stop. Ⴂ must really not know what was going on, but either way he's letting the shorter teen work. Heal him, Aizawa questioned. And 𝐴𝐸, the detective set these people up for failure. They told you nothing about me, huh? Izuku muttered. My quirk is called First Aid. I'm a healer. Aizawa let out a surprise huff and looked over at ⴂ. Izuku was still busy cleaning the wound, but thanks to his hold on the purple-haired teen's arm, felt the movement, a possible shrug. Fine, anything funny and I'll be in Tartarus, I know. Someone let out a snort. Judging by the lack of movement from the other teen, it was Yamada. Izuku had finished cleaning ⴂ's wound, which meant it was time for the actual healing part. The white-haired teen put down the cotton ball he'd doused with rubbing alcohol before getting started. Izuku put his hand at the bottom of the wound, the thinnest part, and dragged his hand up. Clean, uninjured skin was left behind along with a faint green glow before that too disappeared. While Izuku kept his focus on the arm in front of him despite ⴂ's impressed gasp. Izuku stopped his quirk and looked over the arm. Satisfied, he went to grab a compression sleeve from the medical box. If it's healed, why is the sleeve necessary? Yamada asked, sitting down to look at his son's arm from a closer perspective. The skin is still tender, and it will be for the next few days. The green-eyed teen took a deep breath through his nose as he squeezed his eyes shut. Despite how hard he'd slept last night, he hadn't been well rested. 5 hours of deep sleep hadn't made up for going 32 without any. Toshi, go take a nap after lunch. I'm sure the healing drained some energy. Aizawa started and he heard Yamada get up, presumably to get lunch started. Actually, I feel completely fine. ⴂ's voice, and Izuku opened his eyes to see the taller teen staring at him. Does your quirk use your energy or something? Izuku nodded, rubbing his forearm as the pain settled in. It wasn't bad, he'd felt worse, but it was still annoying. I heal people by transferring my energy into others, speeds up their skin cells regeneration or something. Once again, the white-haired teen was on the floor. If he got on the couch, he'd fall asleep. Thank you. Izuku looked up to meet the teen's eyes. The action caused Izuku to notice the white irises. Cool. It's not a big deal. Almost an hour later, lunch was ready and Izuku didn't want to move to get any food. He knew he needed the energy considering he'd healed ⴂ and because Izuku knows he is slightly sleep-deprived. But, honestly, his social awkwardness and need for food are fighting each other. Eventually, his hunger bested him and he got up to join them. Hey, I made some curry, is that okay? Yamada asked, to which the white-haired teen nodded gratefully. Aizawa and Yamada were across each other, meaning Izuku was across from the other teen. So, is anyone going to tell me who you are or why you're here? ⴂ asked after a few bites of his curry. Izuku swallowed his current bite and went to answer. When the Bakugo was rescued, 2 villains were captured, Toga Himiko and myself, Midoriya Izuku. After being held in the precinct for 28 hours, Himiko and I found out our punishment. We'd spend the next 2 to 3 years in UA in the villain rehabilitation program. Izuku looked up to see ⴂ staring, most likely in quiet contemplation. Before you ask, I didn't help kidnap Bakugo. Those fuckers didn't even tell me what was going on. 3 villains were captured then, Aizawa muttered, looking over cautiously to Izuku. All for one was beaten and taken to Tartarus shortly after you and Toga were taken into custody. Silence broke, the heroes and their son waiting as the healer took a moment to process. A snort broke out from said healer before he shoved food into his mouth. You're not upset? The blonde tried. Izuku shook his head. Hell no, that asshole deserved it. 𝐴𝐸, I hope he rots in hell. Tamura's probably pissed though. Dear old dad was all he really cared about. More silence. I never told them who dad was, did I? You're telling me that your father is all for one? Aizawa asked, pacing in front of the couch. They'd moved into the Aizawa Yamada's living room shortly after lunch. They'd sat him on the center of the couch, Yamada on the phone with someone, possibly the detective since they had new information. And ⴂ was sitting in the chair next to the couch, looking awkward. God, sleep sounds so nice. The curry from earlier had helped his energy, but all it did was replenish the energy he'd transferred to the taller teen. Unfortunately, that is correct. Aizawa glared at him and Izuku held his hands up in surrender. Hey, I'm not happy about it either. Yamada finally hung up the phone and joined the conversation. Okay, well, anything else you need to tell us? Izuku paused at the blonde's question. Was there anything? I'm not sure if this counts as what you're looking for, but I've known Bakugo since we were kids. This piece of information piqued ⴂ's interest. You knew Bakugo as a kid. Please tell me you have embarrassing stories of him. Izuku smirked, but Aizawa interrupted with a sigh before he could answer the teen. While it's not as important as knowing how you related to All for One, it is nice to know. The underground hero explained. You two won't have a dramatic reunion when you join my class, will you? Izuku shook his head before pausing to think. He didn't think so. But then again, Katsuki was always an unpredictable asshole, so he shrugged. I don't think we will. He may not even recognize me until I introduce myself. Even then, I don't see him making a huge deal about it. ⴂ leaned forward to respond before either of his dads could. Why wouldn't he recognize you? The white-haired teen leaned forward as well, only because if he continued leaning back, he'd pass out. Well, first off, I haven't seen or talked to him since we were 8. Second, even if he recognizes my name, I look different than when I was 8. For example, my hair is white. The taller teen furrowed his eyebrows, a curious glint in his gaze. What color was your hair before? Green, the same shade as my eyes. I wanted to dye my hair green when the white started showing, but all for one wouldn't let me. Izuku heard his tone grow bitter at the end, but who could blame him? Maybe Snipe will let you, Yamada commented, causing the shorter teen to look up. He might, but I'm not even sure I could get a good color match for the shade my hair was. It's a nice thought, though. The green-eyed teen smiled at the blonde hero before turning his attention to Aizawa, who cleared his throat. Well, since we clearly don't know anything about you, which I'll talk to Tsukachi about when I see him next, tell us about you. Izuku furrowed his brows and set his elbows to rest on his knees. Sure, what do you want to know? The couple's son spoke up first. What's your birthday? Said teen's parents looked at him. What? I want to know. He seems cool. Izuku smirked as he answered. July 15th. The purple-eyed teen leaned back. Huh, I'm older than you by. Shinsu paused in thought before continuing. 2 weeks, exactly. Well, at least you have an excuse to be so much taller than me. You're old. Shinsu gave an offended noise in response. Okay, you problem children, how about you tell us about your quirk? Izuku turned his attention back to Aizawa at his question. Sure, Izuku adjusted his position before continuing. As you know, it's called first aid. If someone has an injury and I touch them, my energy heals their wounds. Because my quirk doesn't rely on the patient's energy, then I can heal bigger, more severe wounds easier than, say, recovery girl can. But I have my limits. Let's say I heal someone who broke their wrist. My energy is lowered, and I now have their pain from their injury. A wince from Shinsu. But before the teen could open his mouth, Izuku continued, I have a high pain tolerance, so it's not that bad. I mean, when Snipe shot Tamura, who do you think healed him? A pain from a scratch isn't going to kill me. Izuku smirked as he looked over to Shinsu, who he'd hoped was smiling at his joke. Instead of a smile, a look of concern and discomfort was on the teen's face. So, Izuku looked over at Aizawa and then Yamada, who wasn't faring much better. And as I've said, their injury is still tender. It's healed, but it's more fragile for a while. Well, that's good to know, Shinsu muttered, still looking uncomfortable. How'd I screw up already? Well, what kind of training do you have? Yamada asked, finally sitting down at the end of the couch closest to his son. Aizawa leaned against the TV stand, looking at Izuku expectantly. Some medical training, obviously, though not enough to be a full-fledged doctor. I have experience with knives and a bow staff. To put it simply, I can fight, but it's not like I've needed to test it out. I wasn't one of the frontliners, they kept me at the base. I analyzed a lot for them too. Aizawa raised an eyebrow. What did you analyze? Izuku brought one of his hands up to support the weight of his head. Heroes, allies, enemies, buildings, most of the time just the best way to take someone down. Izuku knew where this conversation was going. It wasn't about to be pretty. So, you helped with the USJ attack then? And the training camp? Shinsu's voice shook slightly as he asked, and Izuku didn't blame him. Somewhat. Tamura came to me asking theoretical ways to get into the USJ and UA itself. I told him, but he didn't tell me what it was for. I didn't even know about the training camp heist until after the fact. Aizawa looked pissed, Yamada too, and Shinsu just looked dejected. What did they expect? He was a villain raised by villains. It's not like he had a choice. There was a knock at the door and Izuku looked at the clock on the wall. 7:30, Snipe's back. Yamada went with urgency to open the door and Izuku followed, getting his shoes on after confirmation it was Snipe. Thanks for keeping an eye on the sprout. Yamada gave Snipe a tight smile. No problem. Izuku stepped outside next to Snipe as he waved goodbye to the Aizawa Yamadas. The door shut and Snipe looked over at the teen. And though Izuku couldn't see his face through the mask, he imagined it was etched in confusion. They found out I was all for one's kid and then I somewhat helped with the USJ attack. Snipe stiffened before responding. Well, okay then. Seemed like you had an interesting time over there. Izuku shrugged. They headed back across the campus to Snipe's apartment. When they got there, Sunipu took off his mask and looked at Izuku. You know they'll stop judging you for your past eventually, right? Izuku turned to look at his warden after taking off his shoes. What do you mean? Sunipu leaned against the door, mask still in hand. I mean, you won't always be seen as a villain, Sprout. They'll get used to you. I already am. Izuku tore his eyes away from the man's. How? I got your coworker really hurt. The man gave a weird, breathy laugh. Well, sure, in a way you did, but I also shot your brother 3 times. Izuku paused for a moment, taking his warden's words into consideration, and then he snorted, hard. Oh, my Kami. That's right. Izuku was full-blown laughing at this point, clutching his stomach. Guess we're even then. The teen asked in between deep breaths. That's right, Sprout. Now, why don't you go clean up and then work on that packet Nezu gave you? I'll make some dinner. 𝐬𝐻𝑖 nodded at 𝐶𝐻𝑖𝑛 words and headed to the bathroom. The night went by quickly after that, with the teen going to bed around 10:30. After everything, he was exhausted. The next morning, he felt much better, his energy levels back up from his lack of sleep and healing shinsu yesterday. The reminder of his almost friend sent a bitter taste to his mouth. He understood the Aizawa Yamada's distaste of him. He'd helped send a father and husband into the hospital with severe injuries. Despite knowing it was for the best, it did suck he didn't have more keeping him here other than 𝐬𝐻𝑖. The second 𝐬𝐻𝑖 didn't need him, he was out of here. It's not that he minded staying with 𝐶𝐻𝑖𝑛, he was nice and caring, but it wasn't home. Not that the bar with the league had been his home, either. 𝐬𝐻𝑖's home is here, with a chance to be what she wants to be, but 𝐬𝐻𝑖 wants to find his home. Hey, Sprout, are you awake? 𝐬𝐻𝑖 looked over at the doorway to see Snipe. Good, I have another patrol, so Vlad King is coming over with your friend to keep an eye on you too. I figured you may want to see your friend. Thanks, Snipe. When are they coming? The teen exited the bed and followed the hero into the living area. They'll be here in a few minutes. How are you feeling? 𝐬𝐻𝑖 looked up at Snipe after taking a seat on the couch. I'm okay. Why? Shinsu called me and said you healed him yesterday. Wanted to check up on you since you didn't have a lot of energy after you helped him. 𝐬𝐻𝑖's brows furrowed, confusion seeping into his veins. Why would Shinsu care how I was feeling? 𝐬𝐻𝑖 couldn't wrap his head around it. Shinsu called 𝐬𝐻𝑖's warden to make sure he was doing okay. Why? The teen had gotten Shinsu's dad hurt and is related to people who hurt his classmates and friends. Then again, Shinsu was a hero in training, probably just his hero complex. Before 𝐬𝐻𝑖 could respond to the bomb dropped on him, there was a knock on the door. Coming, Snipe said, heading towards the front door. 𝐬𝐻𝑖 stayed put on the couch. He was comfortable. Hell no, he wasn't getting up. 𝐬𝐻𝑖. Suddenly he was being crushed by a blonde girl. The white-haired teen rolled his eyes fondly and wrapped his arms around the girl. The front door shut, and Snipe was nowhere in sight. He must have left, 𝐬𝐻𝑖 thought before replying to his friend. Hey, 𝐬𝐻𝑖. Eventually, the girl got off him, only to sit right next to the younger teen. 𝐬𝐻𝑖, you'll never guess what I did yesterday. 𝐬𝐻𝑖 raised an eyebrow, egging the girl to continue. Vlad King took me shopping. I got cute sweaters now. 𝐬𝐻𝑖 looked over at the hero, who was sitting on the chair next to the couch, keeping an eye on them. The younger teen looked back over at his friend. So, he's treating you okay? 𝐬𝐻𝑖 nodded, so 𝐬𝐻𝑖 smiled. Good. What kind of sweaters did you get? The blonde girl launched into all the different types of sweaters she got. A fond smile etched across 𝐬𝐻𝑖's face as she continued. You forgot one, Vlad's gruff voice sounded. 𝐬𝐻𝑖 looked at him, head tilted to the side in utter confusion. Which one am I? Oh, there is this one pink one. Oh, it's so cute and soft. It has a little bear on it too. 𝐬𝐻𝑖 smiled, green eyes shining. It sounded like 𝐬𝐻𝑖 was doing okay with the hero. Granted, it had only been 2 days, but it showed potential. Vlad King was a good choice for 𝐬𝐻𝑖's warden. He seemed strict, but not strict enough. He didn't care about her health, and similar quirks too. 𝐬𝐻𝑖 hoped Vlad continued being good to 𝐬𝐻𝑖. If the teen needed to, he could get her out of there. He was sure, would be nice if he didn't have to though. The next hurdle is how her classmates treat her. She'd attacked their class on their camping trip, and might have injured some. They might not be the best to her. He'd like to think she'd be with the second years, considering that's where she should be, but with their goal to get a hero license, he doubted that'd be the case. Still, he has hopes that the hero students will treat her decently. It's not like she was a dangerous criminal who did things out of wanting entertainment. She did that stuff to get what she needed to survive, and even then, she realized it was wrong and wanted to change her life around. It wouldn't be fair of them to not give her a chance at least. Despite 𝐬𝐻𝑖's worries, he couldn't help but think she'd be okay. For all 𝐬𝐻𝑖 is dense and a little insane, she's sweet. She worries about the people she cares about, and she tries so hard. 𝐬𝐻𝑖 is always willing to help, even in small ways. So as his friend babbled, he took a breath and listened. Yeah, she'd be okay. It had been a couple of weeks since his visit from 𝐬𝐻𝑖 and Vlad King. 𝐬𝐻𝑖 was sitting at the kitchen counter while 𝐶𝐻𝑖 was cooking. He was on the last stretch of the packet Nedzu had assigned him and began quickly working through the last few questions. The questions weren't easy, but they weren't particularly challenging either. They made him think and work, but the questions didn't tend to take a ridiculously long time for him to figure out the answer. 𝐶𝐻𝑖, like the angel he is, was making katsuden and turned to talk to the teen now and then. Almost done with that homework, Sprout. 𝐬𝐻𝑖 finished the last problem as he spoke. Just finished the last problem. 𝐶𝐻𝑖's eyebrows raised as he looked over. Damn, nice job. He turned back to what he was doing before speaking again. Go wash up before dinner. After dinner, you'll need to go to bed early because tomorrow we'll be running some errands. Errands? 𝐶𝐻𝑖 nodded. Yeah, we have to go get your uniform, schedule, and hand in your packet to Nedzu. You'll also need a tour around campus. 𝐬𝐻𝑖 cringed. He hated socializing, even more so than he did at the league, but he knew it was a necessity. Getting used to being around others would be beneficial if he were an in-person student. Okay, I'll be back then. Izuku got up from his seat at the counter before going down the hall to the bathroom to clean up. As the teen washed his hands, he thought about how school might go, specifically how reuniting with his old friend might go. He could see it going one of two ways. 1. Kaken might be able to overlook his villainy and be happy, in his own Bakugo way, about seeing his friend again. They may talk at lunch, or maybe the blonde would vouch for him to his friends, if he had any. Or 2, which seemed the most likely, Kaken would try to beat the shit out of him. Izuku loved the blonde like a brother, but he's always known the large ego his friend has had. Bakugo Katsuki was always popular in their classes. Izuku was too, thanks to his handy quirk, but Katsuki had a chance at becoming a hero with his flashy power. All of it went to the blonde's head, which in turn made Katsuki incredibly vile to those without the chance to do great. The idea that his childhood friend became a villain. Kaken would kill him. He'd find out in a couple of days though, so he should dwell on the what-ifs right now. Izuku dried his hands and walked back out to the kitchen, finding his bowl of food already on the table waiting for him, 𝚤𝗎 sitting across with his own bowl. Sorry for taking so long, I got lost in my thoughts. Izuku apologized, pulling out his chair to take a seat. No worries, Sprout. Penny for your thoughts. Izuku hesitated. It wasn't that he didn't trust the hero, because he did. Honestly, the teen really appreciated the guy and would likely die for the man. But sharing his thoughts with someone was a rare thing for Izuku. The only handful of people he would are either dead or he hadn't talked to in years. Like Himiko, 𝚤𝗎 would need to accept his thoughts were his and wouldn't be shared with them. I'm okay. Let's go ahead and eat before it gets cold, the teen offered with a small smile. 𝚤𝗎 nodded and they dug in. The next day, Izuku and 𝚤𝗎 were heading up to the main UA campus to turn in Izuku's work packet to Nezu. 𝚤𝗎 seemed tense and Izuku, while rearranging his papers carefully to avoid them getting away from him, decided to ask what was up. Oh, nothing. Nezu just freaks me out. Reminds me of my own days at school. 𝚤𝗎 fumbled with his belt, making sure his gun safety was on and secured. He was their teacher, right? 𝚤𝗎 nodded and led them into the building. Sure was. He was a hard ass but fair. His exams were brutal though. Once, the entire class did really well on an exam, so one of my classmates had said it was easy. 𝚤𝗎 leaned down and whispered, here's a tip for you. Don't ever say anything is easy in front of Nezu. He stood back up to his full height before continuing. He'd remade the test and only half the class passed. Out of that half, only a quarter of them did well on it. Yikes, sounds brutal. 𝚤𝗎 nodded and held open another door leading into what Izuku would assume are the faculty offices. Thankfully, I was part of the few kids who did well on that exam. The fact didn't surprise Izuku. 𝚤𝗎 was one of the smartest heroes he knew about. With his quirk and weapons, 𝚤𝗎 had to have book smarts and street smarts. Otherwise, he and everyone else would be doomed. That's good. Honestly, I would have cried in that situation. Or at least worked myself into a nice anxiety attack. 𝚤𝗎 snorted, really? You seem level-headed, kid. Izuku shrugged, adjusting his grip on the papers. That's because of my time with the League. Though Tamura is my older brother, he is very immature, so I had to grow up. Before my time with them, though, I was a crybaby. I'd cry if I was happy, sad, or angry. No matter the circumstance, I was crying. I got that from my mother. 𝚤𝗎's step slows and he turned slightly to face the teen. What was she like? Izuku's eyes widened in surprise. The last person to ask about his mother was Tamura. His brother wanted to know how Izuku's life was before the League, to understand why Izuku hated it there. She was good. Her name was 𝐴𝐾𝐲. She'd had me young, fresh out of high school. She'd make me amazing meals every day and we'd binge all kinds of movies. She called me her little miracle. Izuku's eyes began to burn, though a smile was etched on his face. I wish I could have met her. 𝚤𝗎 whispers and Izuku breathes deeply as he blinks back tears. Yeah, I do too. Eventually, the two made it to Nezu's office. They both bow respectfully before taking their seats. Good morning, you two. Midoriya-kun, do you have that packet ready for me? Izuku nods and hands the stack of papers to Nezu, who takes it happily. Very good. I'll have these graded by the end of your tour. First, let's discuss your schedule and then we can get you to Recovery Girl for a checkup. You'll have lunch afterwards before going on a tour. Reasonable? Yes, Nezu-san. The Chimera smiled and clasped his paws together. Fantastic. Now, considering the intelligence you've seemed to exhibit, I'd say you're at least on par with your soon-to-be peers, meaning you'll at least have most of your classes with them. Izuku relaxed his shoulders slightly out of relief. He'd been worried about being behind due to how slow his online courses moved. If you're struggling in one of the subjects, you'll have extra lessons with me. I would like to have an analysis class with you regardless of this, but it'd be nice if you end up testing out of a certain class. If you test out of a subject, then we can use that time for analysis. If not, then I'd like to have lessons with you before homeroom. Izuku smiled and nodded along. That sounds nice. I'm an early bird anyway. Snipe grunted in agreement, leaning forward to rest his elbows on his knees. He is. Most days he's awake by 5. 𝐻𝐸 makes an odd noise which 𝐬𝐸 thinks might be his version of chuckling. Then if needed I'll make sure to have some breakfast and tea here for us to enjoy during the lesson. The chimera starts twitching his ears as he talks. You'll have lessons with Recovery Girl after school. Since you have a quirk similar to hers, she'd like to train you to be her apprentice starting as early as next year. 𝐬𝐸 has to resist the urge to be a fanboy. Recovery Girl had been his second favorite hero, second only to All Might, and before his third favorite Eraserhead. It sucks one of his favorites didn't like him. Thought 𝐬𝐸 couldn't blame the man. His brother had tried to kill him, or flirt with him. Even 𝐬𝐸 wasn't sure which it was. You'll have therapy during homeroom on Wednesdays and Fridays with Hound Dog, just as Toga-chan will have as well. Of course, different days, but the therapy is mandatory. 𝐬𝐸 nodded. It was a fair requirement. Other than that, your schedule will be almost the same as any other hero in training. A knock sounded on the door and Recovery Girl walked in shortly after. Well, off you go 𝐬𝐸-kun, I'll see you in a few hours. 𝐬𝐸 looked over at Snipe, a silent goodbye, and walked towards Recovery Girl. Hello, you must be Midoriya. Come on now, we have a lot to do. I'll take your measurements and send them to Power Loader. He needs to get your uniform tailored, which you'll get before the end of the day. Then I'll do a checkup and walk you to the cafeteria. After a short walk they were at the infirmary, and 𝐬𝐸 held out his arms as the woman took a measuring tape and started writing out his measurements. Shortly after she walked over to her computer, opened on what the teen assumed was an email to Power Loader, and typed something out before closing out of the tab. Now let's get your checkup started. Tell me your age, date of birth, explain your quirk, and past major injuries. Okay, I'm 15. My date of birth is July 15. My quirk is called First Aid the Heroine Cut Him Off. That's right, I have your quirk information already. The detective in 𝐻𝐸 filled me in. Just tell me about past major injuries then. She's blunt right. I sprained my wrist when I was 7. Had my arm broken at 9. 2 cracked ribs at 11. A broken leg at 12. 𝐬𝐸 thought for a moment before continuing. I got a concussion at 12 as well as a punctured lung. I had a broken shoulder at 14 and I think that's it. Recovery Girl grimaced. Training gone south. 𝐬𝐸 gave a confirming hum as she wrote down the information. All right then, let's begin. She measured his height and had him weighed, among other basic checkup stuff. He'd grown an inch since he'd last checked, making him 5'6", which he was quite proud of. Before 𝐬𝐸 had a real chance to talk to the heroine, she dragged him to the cafeteria to get some food, which Lunch Rush happily provided. The teen was slightly underweight and had been given a meal plan to gain what he was missing. He'd gotten a very protein-packed lunch. Though he wasn't complaining, the food was delicious. It was odd to think about just how much living with the League had affected his health. He hadn't ever thought about being underfed until he'd been told so by Recovery Girl. Though, looking back on it, he certainly should have noticed the signs. He'd be given smaller proportions than Tamura had and had gotten hurt more frequently, which should have made him understand how weak he'd been. Hey, Sprout, he heard as he finished up his meal. Lunch Rush, though in the kitchen, had been close enough to watch him, but otherwise, he'd been alone. Therefore, he'd heard Snipe coming. Ready for a tour? 𝐬𝐸 nodded before going to put away his tray. Thank you, Lunch Rush. The food was delicious. The hero gave a kind nod and went back to what they were doing. The teen turned back to his warden and gave a thumbs up. Ready. Snipe snorted and led the way. They'd gone all over the school, from 𝐬𝐸's soon-to-be classroom to all the gyms and locker rooms. It was an interesting layout, though 𝐬𝐸 already faintly knew it. Of course, the layout of the inside of the school wasn't anywhere online. The only way 𝐬𝐸 would have known much about the inside layout is through the security cameras, but those were set up by 𝐻𝐸 himself, so they were almost impossible to get into. The teen did know the layout of the training fields and gyms thanks to his obsession back when he was a kid. As they looked around, 𝐬𝐸 planned how his mornings would go in his head, the best route he'd take to the classroom, if he should get to school early, or what he'd need to do. Mostly he was thinking about how Kaken would react. 𝐬𝐸 hoped that the blonde would just act calm until lunch and then they'd have a nice reunion. Though it was more likely 𝐬𝐸 would get struck by lightning than for Bakugo Katsuki to be calm. Finally, they made it back to 𝐻𝐸's office again, walking inside to see a uniform hanging on the cabinet. At least 𝐬𝐸 assumed that's what it was. Hello Midoriya-kun. I am pleased to inform you that you've tested out math and history. Seems you and I may have to work on your English grammar during one of those periods. 𝐬𝐸 snorted. Yeah, English is difficult for me. I can speak it well, but writing it is a whole new ordeal. 𝐻𝐸 made the noise similar to chuckling again. Completely fair. I know Aizawa-san had trouble with English back when he was in school. Snipe snorted. It was the one subject I beat him in. Then again, I did have an American parent, so perhaps I cheated a little. Snipe explained, head turned slightly towards 𝐬𝐸. It's not cheating, you were just using your resources. The teen shrugged. 𝐻𝐸's smile sharpened. Well, that's all for today Midoriya-kun. Thank you for getting this packet back with me so quickly. I'll go ahead and let you know you and Toga's uniforms are different than everyone else's, so do not be alarmed when you put it on and see how different it is. Izuku thanked the Chimera and bowed respectfully as a goodbye. Thanks for your time, Nezu-sensei. Izuku smirked and the Chimera let out the chuckling noise once more. Come on, Sprout. Let's head home. Izuku blinked his eyes open. Looking over at his alarm clock, he saw it was only 5 in the morning. He sighed and thought about trying to escape. It might be worth it, he thought, rubbing at his face before turning over to stare out his window. He really didn't want to find out how 𝐻𝐻𝐿 would react to him. Izuku genuinely hoped the blonde would be happy to reunite with his childhood friend. But a small part of Izuku felt maybe Katsuki wouldn't even remember him. What if Izuku sits there, waiting for 𝐻𝐻𝐿 to put the pieces together and then he just doesn't? He's not sure if that'll be better or worse. But if 𝐻𝐻𝐿 doesn't remember him, then Izuku will pretend he doesn't know the blonde either, and if he does remember Izuku, the healer will cross that bridge when he gets to it. A knock sounded at his door, and he propped himself up on his elbows to see Suneppu poke his head in. Morning, Sprout. I'm making omelets. Izuku gave a tired smile and started getting out of bed. When he made it to the kitchen, he saw a plate already waiting for him. Go ahead and start eating so you can get ready. I'm sure you want to get to the school early. Izuku smiled despite the spike in his anxiety. Thank you for the food. Izuku started eating, planning his day in his head. Mostly he was planning what he'd say to the class. Would he say anything, or would Aizawa want him to be quiet? Izuku swallowed his bite of food and looked nervously at his warden, who just sat down to eat his omelet. Do you know if I have to introduce myself to the class? Suneppu paused to look at the team before nodding. Yep, it's part of the protocol. You'll state your name, quirk, and what you did for the league. It's mostly for the comfort of the students. Izuku nodded and began eating again. It made sense to tell his new classmates about his crimes and quirk. They would know who he was and what to expect from him, how dangerous he is. My crimes don't even cover how dangerous I could be, he thought bitterly. Soon enough, his omelet was gone, and he got up to wash his dishes before going to the bathroom to brush his teeth. He attempted to fix his hair. Over his time at the league, he hadn't taken great care of his hair, leaving it more frizzy than curly. Suneppu offered to get products to help, but Izuku had no idea which to get. His dad had lost his hair long ago and times had changed, and products with it. Izuku missed his defined curls, but not much he can do about it now. He gave up and went to his room and started putting on his uniform. It was different from the normal uniform, as Nezu had warned. Instead of the turquoise pants, they were black, and the gray uniform jacket was a darker shade. The red tie was blood red instead of the brightly colored ones the normal students would wear. Izuku took a deep breath and looked over at the clock, seeing it was 6:30. He looked through his book bag, an old blue one Suneppu had found for him. Sure enough, Izuku had everything he needed. For the first time in his life, he wished he could sleep in. Now that he's awake and has done everything he needed to, he'll have time to do nothing but think. Normally, Izuku doesn't mind thinking. It's what kept him relatively safe with the league, his ability to stop and think. But there are times when he shouldn't sit in his head. Now, hours before being introduced to his classmates he's helped attack, and being reintroduced to his childhood friend, 𝐻𝐻𝐿, though rough around the edges, was a good friend to Izuku. Competitive, sure, but Izuku knew that meant he was seen as on par with the blonde. Of course, when Izuku was little it would annoy him, but a week with his dad and new brother made him miss the antics. Izuku wasn't sure what he'd do if Katsuki hated him. Honestly, he'd be heartbroken, but he wouldn't feel like he had a right to cry or be physically upset. After all, Izuku planned everything out for the league, which included plans to take down his classmates. I wonder if it's too early to escape. Hey, Sprout, time to head up to the main campus. You'll be there about half an hour early. Izuku looked over at the clock, realizing it was almost 8. Okay, Izuku got up off his bed, which now that he thinks about it he doesn't remember sitting down, and went over to grab his bag. You okay there, kid? Snipe asked when the teen stopped in front of him. Izuku took a deep breath and nodded. I'm fine, let's get today over with, Izuku muttered. Snipe tilted his head as the teen walked past him, and eventually, Izuku heard the steps of the hero following him. The walk to the main campus was slow and quiet, or perhaps it wasn't slow at all and Izuku was just dreading the impending doom. When they got on campus they went to the teacher's lounge. Inside were Midnight, Powerloader, and the Aizawa Yamada family. Looking around he also saw Himiko and her warden Vlad King. Izuku-kun. He just barely saw her before hearing her voice. And suddenly his arms were full of a blonde girl bearing her fangs and a bright grin. Aren't you excited? I haven't been in school in forever. Our uniforms are so cute too. Well, they'd be cuter with more red or pink, but I'll take the red tie. Izuku just gave a smile and nodded along with the hyper teen. Oh, did you test out of anything? You're super smart, I wouldn't be surprised. What's your schedule like? I tested out of history and math. Nezu says he and I need to work on my grammar and English. I'll also be working on my analysis with him and I'll have after-school lessons with Recovery Girl. He explained, to which Himiko pouted. Izuku followed the movement in the corner of his eye to see Snipe sit down at a table, making conversation with Midnight. Lucky, I hate math and history. I'm a little behind in those subjects in chemistry. Himiko babbled on and Izuku nodded along. Another movement from the corner of his eye and suddenly Vlad King was standing up from his seat. Okay, Himiko, we have to head to your new class so you can get familiar with everything. The girl in question frowned as she gave Izuku a goodbye hug and followed her warden to her classroom. Now, Vlad taking Himiko to get familiar with the classroom would make sense if it weren't for there still being 20 minutes until classes start. So Izuku looked around to find whoever was staring at him. In doing so, he noticed the Shinsu teen had left. After noticing this, the white-haired teen noticed Aizawa staring at him. So, Izuku leaned against the wall, arms crossed, and an eyebrow raised, logical ruse. Aizawa glared minutely. You're going to stay outside the classroom until I call you in. When you come in the room, you'll introduce yourself to the class. You'll tell them your name, about your quirk, and what you did for the league. Then you'll sit at the desk I have next to the podium so everyone can keep an eye on you. Izuku was going to keep quiet. He truly was. But something about the way Aizawa was talking to him reminded him too much of the villains he was raised with. He'd always had to have all eyes on him because God forbid their precious healer get out of their clutches. Izuku was his person for Kami's sake. He wasn't a saint, but no one was. Izuku also wasn't a child who needed to be babysat. He hasn't been a kid since he stepped foot in that God-forsaken bar. What? You need to show off the shiny new healer. Snipe sat up in shock at the tone in Izuku's voice. Snipe treated him like a human, not a new toy for everyone to enjoy. Not someone there for the convenience of others. All that meant Izuku was always respectful to the hero, but Aizawa hadn't shown him an ounce of kindness or respect. Izuku knows what he's done, and he knows that Eraserhead has no reason to like him. But heroes are meant to treat everyone with some kind of humility. Izuku pushed off the wall and walked a little closer to the hero, stopping a couple of feet in front of him. Listen, Eraserhead, I know you don't like me. You have every reason not to, and I won't blame you for that. But trust that you won't get an ounce of my respect if you treat me like I'm a child who needs to be monitored. I haven't been a kid since I was 8. I have been pushed past my limits, beaten, scarred, bruised, battered, and monitored since my father gained full control over my life. I don't need to be babysat. I grew up a long time ago. I'm here for Himiko, and that's it. You need proof I'll behave. Just make sure Himiko is happy, and you won't have a thing to worry about. Izuku is good at staying calm and collected, which is what he did throughout his speech. He's learned over the years anger gets him nowhere. Aizawa must have the same opinion because despite the anger behind the hero's eyes, his breaths are even and there isn't a trace of aggression in his stance. Suddenly, the teen felt the familiar weight of Snipe's hand in his hair, ruffling his hair almost fondly. The sprout's right, Aizawa-san. Izuku is a good kid. Just treat him like a human being and he'll treat you with respect too. Aizawa frowned and got up. Classes start soon. Come on, Midoriya. Izuku shot a quick goodbye to his warden and followed behind Eraserhead. Eventually, they made it outside of the classroom, and as Aizawa walked into the room, Izuku stayed right outside the door, listening for his cue. Okay, you hellion, settle down. The class silenced, and Izuku heard the hero huff. As you may know, a lot happened over the break, including the return of Bakugo and the capture of a few of the league's members. 2 of those members are minors and have been enrolled here at 𝑢 in a rehabilitation program set up by Principal Nenzu. Whispers broke out for a moment before silence a moment later. That being said, one of the members enrolled was not directly involved with you, meaning you haven't met them face to face. Today, he will be joining your class. I, and other teachers, will be sure this will not affect your safety. Come on in. Izuku opened the door and walked in. Hearing a startled gasp and movement coming from Bakugo's seat, most would assume that it was a shock seeing him again from the league's base. But Izuku, Aizawa, Shinsu, and of course, Kaken all knew the real reason. So, he recognizes me. My name is Midoriya Izuku. I was the league's analyst and healer. My quirk is called First Aid. Basically, I use my own energy to heal people and in return, get their pain. He bowed, and just as he was about to go to the seat next to the podium, there was a startled shout from 𝗀𝗏, whom Izuku recognized from the sports festival. How is he a villain? He has a healing quirk. Shinsu's quirk is more villainous than that. Izuku was so startled by this comment he did a double take. There's no such thing as a villainous quirk, Izuku said, squinting his eyes in confusion. This caused 𝗀𝗏 to snort. Sure, there is. Shinsu's quirk is literally called brainwash. It seems pretty villainous to me. I mean, how can a healing quirk be dangerous? Suddenly, Izuku wasn't in a classroom at 𝑢. He was 7, and at school, Kaken sitting next to him. A new kid had joined the class, one with a nature quirk. He wanted to be a hero too, so Kaken and he went to talk with him. When Kaken had explained his quirk the best a 7-year-old knew how, the new kid had called him a villain. Explosions hurt people. It was the one time Izuku had seen his friend so quiet. Let me help you imagine then. My quirk uses my own energy and doesn't leave behind scars. If I needed information, or to let my anger out, I could torture someone and heal them again and again. I'm good at hiding my depleted energy and the pain I take on. My victim wouldn't have any trace of what I'd done on them. Izuku tilted his head. Seeing Minda's haunted look on his face made him grin. Is that villainous enough for you? Everyone was awfully quiet. Izuku figured if Minda hadn't brought Shinsu into the mix, Aizawa would be sending Izuku to Tartarus. He sat down in his seat, proud of the fear he embedded in Minda. Okay, heathens, enjoy the rest of homeroom. If you choose to acquaint yourself with your new classmate, be alert. Izuku rolled his eyes, and the class broke out into whispers, some staring at him with caution. It wasn't until their blonde explosive classmate walked up to Izuku that people got quiet again. So, he's either about to kill me, fight me, or hug me. When Katsuki got up to the white-haired teen, he glared down at Izuku. Izuku, what the fuck happened to your hair? Excuse me. Suddenly his face was squished in between the explosive teen's hands and he was being moved around in his seat. Seriously, what is this shit, Zuku? You look like an old man. Izuku heard chairs scraping and saw people stand up curiously, deciding what to do. Seriously, Kaken, Izuku said, face muffled thanks to his friend's hands in the way. You don't see me for 8 years and that's the first thing you say to me. The blonde dropped him, causing Izuku to fall back into his seat. Where's the hay? Or even a punch to the face. Katsuki scoffed. Please, I'm not stupid. You of all people should know that. You, willingly resorting to villainy. I'm assuming it was something to do with your old man. Izuku grinned a little. Such faith you have in me. Izuku looked back up at his friend. Nice to see you again, Kaken. Oh, I know, I'm a treat to be around. Izuku rolled his eyes. I guess I missed you. The shorter teen let out an exasperated gasp. Bakugo Katsuki admitting to have missed someone. Shut the hell up. So, wait, the gravity girl. Uraraka, Izuku remembered, said looking between Izuku and the older teen. You two know each other. Kaken grinned. A feral thing just like he did when they were kids. Of course we do. We've known each other since we were brats. Our mothers were best friends, so we've known each other our entire lives almost. Izuku smirked at the blonde's explanation and looked to the girl to add on to the conversation. Yeah, Kaken and I were actually with each other when our quirks manifested. Izuku rested his head on his hand, staring at the class with amusement. The group was taking his presence better than the teacher, which genuinely baffled him. Really? That's certainly interesting, Todoroki responded, glaring at Kaken with uncertainty. Izuku wasn't sure why, but he had some guesses. What's it to you, Isahat? The healer couldn't help it if he tried. He snorted. What are you laughing at, Zuku? The blonde turned his glare onto Izuku, which sobered him up. You're still using nicknames for everyone. What was that one you used to call me again? Izuku looked up and thought before slamming his hands down on the desk, noticing a sharp jump in the hero nearby. Deku, that's what it was. Kaminari, another loud blonde, spoke up. Deku, why'd he call you that? Izuku looked at Bakugo to explain. Honestly, the white-haired teen had forgotten about the reasoning behind that nickname. Katsuki rolled his eyes. Because of the way Izuku is written in kanji, I read the last part of Izuku as Deku. Misread, you mean? Burnt caramel filled the air. Though the threat was there, it was empty. Okay, you hellions. Homeroom is over. History is starting. Midoriya, you need to have someone escort you to Netsu's office. Katsuki glared at their teacher. He didn't fucking do anything. Izuku put his hand on his friend's shoulder. Kat, relax. I tested out of history and math, so I'll be going to Netsu's office to refine my analysis skills and to work on English. Kaken breathed out before laughing. Still a nerd, I see. Izuku rolled his eyes. Says the one who has an 8 p.m. bedtime. Izuku stated as he grabbed his bag and headed towards the door, Katsuki right behind him. Oi. Before Izuku knew it, it was lunchtime. He was required to stay in the classroom and eat. Fortunately, Katsuki decided to stay with him. Shinsu and Aizawa stayed as well, talking amongst themselves. Izuku assumed Shinsu didn't talk to many of his classmates, and that translated into not having any friends. He'd thought about asking if the teen wanted to eat with them, but there was no reason Shinsu would. So, you going to tell me what the hell happened to you, or? Katsuki started. It had only been 10 minutes into lunch, enough for the two to open their bento and get settled. Thankfully, Snipe had prepared some lunch for Izuku, so he didn't need to leave the classroom. It's like you said, something to do with my dad. You know, that faceless villain that the League associated with? Katsuki shoved some food into his mouth before nodding thoughtfully as he chewed. Yeah, all for one. The asshole All Might took down. Izuku looked at Katsuki. It took a second for the blonde to catch up, but when he did, he almost choked. That was Uncle Hisashi. He screamed before his choking caught up with him and a coughing fit took place. Izuku patted his friend on the back in an attempt to help him as he laughed. I know, right? Man's seen better days. Katsuki snorted. That was foul. Before the younger teen could respond, a familiar, panicked voice called for him. He looked around to see Himiko, who was getting glared at by his homeroom teacher. Himiko, what's wrong? He got up and met her. Her eyes were bloodshot and her breathing was ragged. "Hemi, when's the last time you ate?" She whimpered. "Last night. I was so nervous I couldn't eat this morning and one of the students threw away her legs wobbled and Izuku caught her." "Katsuki, help." The younger blonde hesitated for a second before coming to his aid. "Eraserhead, either you stop glaring and be a hero and help us, or so help me God, I will show everyone in this building how dangerous I can be." Aizawa glared and helped with Himiko, and they all went to the nurse's office to get something for Himiko to eat. When they got there, recovery girl ushered them to sit the girl on the bed and went to look for a blood bag. "I don't have any blood. Is there anything you think is best to substitute it?" Izuku cursed. "Just draw some from me. If she weren't this weak, any blood would be fine," but Izuku trailed off. Recovery girl nodded and went to grab a needle and a blood bag. "Eraserhead, I know you aren't fond of us villains, but for fuck's sake, you saw a teenage girl pale as a ghost, and you just glare at her. She's here to redeem herself, not get judged for desperate decisions. Don't talk to him like that. You have no right." Shinsu defended, anger rolling off him in waves. There was quiet and recovery girl got to work drawing blood from the youngest teen in the room. As she left to get bandages, Eraserhead sighed. "Bakugo, go back to lunch. You too, Shinsu, go." It must not be known that Shinsu is his son, Izuku thought. Both boys were hesitant but left nonetheless, which shocked Izuku. He half expected Kaken to tell Aizawa to fuck off and stay anyways. But people mature, Izuku supposed. When they left, Aizawa sighed and sat down in a chair across from them. "I'm sorry. You were right. I was being stubborn and immature when I ignored her help. I'm a hero and it's my job to help both of you in any way I can. It's not fair to you two for me to judge you both on past actions, especially when it seems most of the students don't hold a grudge against you." Izuku's brows rose. "I will try to do better," he sighed, leaning back in the chair. Izuku looked over at the bag containing his blood. It was almost full and recovery girl would be here to take the needle out soon. Not that he couldn't do it himself if needed. Honestly, Izuku wanted to be petty and not forgive the hero, but the truth was, Izuku knew how good of work Aizawa does as his hero persona, Eraserhead. How he's acting as his teacher doesn't seem to match with what he knows of the man's hero work, so there has to be a reason he's acting this way. "I know you do good work as Eraserhead, so, for you to be treating us so coldly, I know there must be a reason. It doesn't excuse it, but I'm sure there must be some reason behind it. So, I'll put my trust and faith in your heroic attributes. I'm willing to work on this." I can't say the same for Himiko. The girl was staring at the blood, hungrily, and Izuku knew she didn't have long. He took out the needle as the bag was full and prepared it for her, eventually handing her the bag, which she, almost literally, tore into. "Oh dear, here's some bandages to wrap your arm. I got you some juice as well." Izuku bowed gratefully and started to sip on the juice. "I appreciate you trying and being patient," Aizawa-sensei spoke, shoulders relaxed. Izuku shrugged. He didn't know how to respond to that. "Go ahead and go back to the classroom. I'm sure Hitoshi is still waiting outside. He can walk you back." Izuku finished off the last of his juice and headed back to the hallway, noticing Shinsu was indeed still there. "Aizawa-sensei said you could walk me back." Shinsu sighed, a scowl evident on your face. As they started walking, Izuku gathered some courage to speak to the older teen. "You know, you seem pretty annoyed to be walking with me considering just a couple of weeks ago you thought I was cool." Shinsu stopped, anger clear. "That was before I knew what you did before you talked to my..." He stopped and sighed. "Villains aren't cool." Ouch. Well, if I remember correctly, that purple-headed dwarf called you a villain. How about you get to know someone's story and understand why they are the way they are before you label them as such? Shinsu glared, his face red. "You're the one who's been calling yourself a villain. Now I'm at fault for agreeing with you." Izuku glared at the taller teen, tears pricking his eyes. "He's not going to cry though. That was rule number 2. If you cry, never let anyone know you did. I know my story, I know my deeds and my failures. You know nothing. Don't act like you do." He turned around and headed back to the classroom, tears silently staining his cheeks as he did. The end of the day came quickly. Izuku was back in Snipe's apartment, sitting at the counter doing homework as Snipe cooked some dinner before his patrol. "I'll be back by 10, he said as he mixed the ingredients. "I have Midnight coming over to keep watch. Is that okay with you?" Izuku hummed in agreement and finished up his English assignment. "You okay, Sprout?" Izuku nodded before speaking. "Long day. Tomorrow will be longer considering I'll be participating as an on-site healer during the heroics lesson." Snipe hesitated. "I'll pack you some more food, so you won't get drained," he finally said, turning around to give Izuku a look, which the teen would assume was a smile if it weren't for the mask being in the way. "Thank, Snipe." There was a long silence before his warden spoke again. "Call me Haruki." Izuku looked up, stunned before hesitantly replying. "Okay, Haruki. You can call me Izuku." It was the next morning and Izuku was in homeroom, talking with Kaken as he did yesterday, accompanied by Kirishima and Uraraka. "So, Midoriya, what was Bakugo talking about with your hair yesterday?" Kirishima asked, leaning against the wall near Izuku's desk. 𝐬𝐻𝐻 leaned against his hand with a small grin. Well, back when 𝐀𝐦 and I were little, my hair was a dark green. After a few years, my hair turned white. Kirishima snorted in response. You're kidding. I guess your name is Midoriya after all, Kirishima began, getting interrupted with a swift elbow to the side from 𝑢ruRaka. Be nice, Kirishima-kun. Midoriya-kun probably heard that a lot growing up, 𝑢ruRaka said, huffing in exasperation. Be a little original at least, she teased. Izuku decided then and there 𝑢ruRaka had his loyalty right alongside Himiko, Kaken, and Snipe. Katsuki let out a feral laugh. Yeah, shitty hair. The original. Izuku snorted. Suddenly, Eraserhead was standing up from his sleeping bag and addressing the class. Okay, it's time for your core classes to start. I will see you all for ethics and heroics. Then he turned towards Izuku. Midoriya, I'll walk you to the principal's office today. I need to talk with him anyway. Izuku nodded and grabbed his bag, waving goodbye to Kaken and the others before walking outside to meet his teacher. Come on, kid. Izuku matched the teacher's stride, and as they made their way to Nezu-sensei's office, Eraserhead spoke again. I'm sorry about Hitoshi. He muttered lowly, and Izuku looked up slightly confused. He's had a hard life. Not that that excuses his behavior towards you, and trust I've talked to him about it. But for the record, he is sorry. Izuku sighed and looked ahead again before replying. As much as I want to believe that, I haven't been shown anything that proves otherwise. I don't like people making assumptions about me or my character. I call myself a villain cause I know about my story and my actions. He doesn't know shit. So, until I hear it from the horse's mouth, I'm not going to go out of my way to befriend him. Aizawa sighed and nodded. Fair enough. And they reached the office, and as they did, Eraserhead turned back around. So, he just walked me here to say that? Ha. Izuku rolled his eyes and headed inside. Good morning, Midoriya-kun. Are you ready to begin? Izuku bowed in greeting before sitting down, gingerly taking the tea and sipping it. Ready as I'll ever be, he said, and with that, the lesson began. Nezu's grin sharpened, and he pulled up some analysis Izuku had done in his lessons yesterday. These were very well done. However, I do want you to consider ways for these quirks to grow along with how they can weaken as well. As of right now, you're focusing on how the quirk works, and while that is extremely important, it isn't the only thing to quirk analysis there is. Izuku nodded, making mental notes of the pointers Nezu-sensei was giving him. Thankfully, Nezu-sensei wasn't big on physical notes. In the principal's mind, as long as it works for the student, he doesn't see why physical notes would be more important than thinking about the material presented to him. I see. So instead of the mechanics of the quirk, you're wanting me to think of ways to expand the limits of the quirk itself. Nezu nodded. Precisely. I do understand pointing out weakness is something you've already done for the League. However, it can be beneficial in heroics as well. Take Snipe for example. He understands weak points in quirk and human bodies, so he best knows where to aim. It's very important in taking down criminals. Izuku nodded along. Could you find a weakness in one of your classmates? Someone you may not have analyzed thoroughly before? Izuku thought momentarily before deciding who was best in his class to analyze. He didn't want to analyze Kaken or 𝑢ruRaka. That would seem traitorous. But he also couldn't choose someone like Todoroki or Shinsu, as he had spent way too much time on their quirks back when he was with the League. Suddenly a purple-headed dwarf came to mind. 𝗀𝐻𝐷 had been on his shit list from the second he brought up villainous quirks. It pissed Izuku off majorly, and maybe he just wanted an excuse to shit-talk him. 𝗀𝐻𝐷 is practically useless if his arms are incapacitated. His quirk is quiet, literally hands-on. If he doesn't have his hands at his disposal, it renders him practically quirkless. While there is nothing wrong with that in a moral sense, but it does mean it leaves a huge advantage to villains and even lowly criminals. The only way I can see him getting around this weakness is a support item that can pop the balls off of his head when his arms aren't available to do so. Izuku explains. Nezu smiled and sipped on his tea before responding. What made you choose him, Midoriya-kun? Izuku stiffened. Just trying to be helpful, he lied, though it didn't seem like Nezu believed him, which was fair considering Izuku was being untruthful. I'll believe you for now, though I should tell you, while I don't believe your intentions on choosing him were for any malicious reason, you may want to reconsider that lie. It might cause trouble down the line. Izuku forced himself not to roll his eyes as he sighed. Fine, if you must know, I wanted an excuse to shit-talk him. After I introduced myself to the class, he called my quirk heroic while shitting on Shinsu's. Nezu's nose twitched in curiosity. I was under the impression Shinsu and you do not get along. So, he saw our spat. No, we don't. But that doesn't mean I hate him, nor does it mean I will sit back and let someone be discriminatory towards him. Whether he and I get along or not, he's a person and doesn't deserve that. Izuku sat back in his chair, hands resting in his lap. He couldn't help but stand up for the older teen despite their bad blood. Izuku hated that he couldn't get along with the boy because of his past. Perhaps in another universe they're close friends. A universe where Izuku grew up to be a hero or a doctor or something else other than what he had. He can't help that life, specifically life with his father, led him down that path, forced him down that road, and despite this, he's dealing with the consequences. Izuku hates being a villain, but unfortunately that's what he is, what he always will be. Whether he chooses to be a doctor or a hero after school, no matter how many people he saves, no matter how many lives he's changed for the better, his past will always be tied to who he is. If Izuku can't even look past it, how could anyone else, let alone the students who are now his classmates that have been directly affected by his actions? Midoriya-kun, Izuku snapped out of his thoughts at the Chimera's voice. For someone who claims to be a villain, you truly do have the heart of a hero. I'm sorry if some people aren't seeing that. Izuku blinked back tears as he took a deep breath. They are allowed to think whatever they want of me. Nothing anyone else can do about it. After a couple of deep breaths, Izuku looked at his principal in the eyes. No use in getting upset at other people's perceptions of me. Nezu simply nodded before looking at the time. It's time for your next class, Midoriya-kun. I believe Aizawa-kun is waiting outside for you. Izuku grabbed his bag with a bow. See you for English tutoring. Nezu nodded and Izuku opened the door to find Eraserhead sat outside, just as Nezu had said. Let's get you to English, problem child. Izuku's brow furrowed at the new name. Problem child. Yes, you're a problem child. Only problem children use an analysis lesson to shit-talk a classmate they don't like. Izuku suddenly found the ground very interesting as they walked. It had been a couple of hours since the school day had started and it was almost time for heroics. Izuku had some extra snacks packed in his bag, including some gummies he'd taken from Recovery Girl's office with her permission. Lunch was the last thing before heroics, so currently Izuku, Kaken, Uraraka, Shinsu, and Aizawa-sensei were in the classroom eating. The father-son duo was talking, discussing the use of a capture weapon from what Izuku could tell, and he assumed that meant Shinsu was training how to use one. Uraraka and Kaken were talking with him eating their lunch. Midoriya-kun, are you excited to join our heroics lesson? Uraraka asked before shoving some food into her mouth. I guess I'll just be sitting there watching you train. I doubt I'll be needed. Kaken suddenly snorted. Nerd, everyone in this class gets injuries. You'll have it rough next class. Izuku groaned. Thank God Snipe packed me extra snacks. Uraraka swallowed her food and looked at Izuku with a curious gaze. Does your energy for your quirk depend on your food intake? She asked before shoving another bite in her mouth. Izuku considered how to answer. It wasn't that his energy relied on it, but food is fuel, so maybe in a way it did. Not necessarily. Just like you, I need food to keep my body functioning properly. The more I eat, the more energy I have to burn. The more energy I have, the more energy I can put into healing people with my quirk. And the less energy I have, the harder it is for me to heal. Uraraka hummed in consideration before answering. So, if you don't have any energy to give, you can't heal, right? Izuku shook his head. No, I can still heal, it just hurts more. Kaken paused his eating to look at him. What the fuck do you mean you can still heal with no energy? You couldn't when we were kids. Izuku shrugged. Training. Izuku really didn't want to get into the hours of training his father and the doctor put him through. Most of that training was spent trying to heal All For One's injuries from his first battle with All Might. Katsuki seemed like he was going to pry, but Uraraka, bless her, cut in. Well, speaking of training, we chose our code names and had our hero uniforms made earlier this semester. Have you had a chance to design your hero persona? Izuku shook his head. No, I haven't given it much thought if I'm honest. I don't think I'll be a hero when I graduate. Uraraka tilted her head in confusion, to which Kaken answered. He's wanted to be a doctor since he was little. The blonde turned towards Izuku, right? Izuku smiled. He remembered. Kaken rolled his eyes. Of course I did. That's all you talked about when we were little. It was Izuku's turn to snort. Like you didn't only talk about being a hero. Uraraka covered her mouth in a fit of laughter. You guys are like siblings, it's adorable. Izuku flushed at the same time Katsuki told her to shut up. The bell rang and Izuku scarfed down the rest of his food before packing up, ready to go to heroics. Midoriya, Aizawa called, to which Izuku looked over at the man. Go ahead to Ground Delta. Midnight is waiting outside for you to show you the way. Do you have everything you'll need? Izuku nodded and held up his medical bag. Of course, most of the stuff in there he wouldn't need as he could heal most injuries, but in case his energy got too depleted it was good to have backup. Good. Aizawa nodded his approval and Izuku went to go meet Midnight outside. About 15 minutes later Izuku was sat up at the training grounds, a small station outside of the entrance exit with a table and chair underneath a tarp for some shade. He had his medical supplies out and neatly organized. When the class got there Izuku had to look away. Years ago, before Izuku had really settled on wanting to be a doctor, so he'd been around 7, he thought about going into support. He'd created a hero costume for Katsuki, and lo and behold, 9 years later Katsuki was wearing it. And he calls me a nerd, he thought fondly. Despite what he'd told himself for years, he really did miss Kaken. No matter how much Himiko meant to him, Katsuki would always be his best friend. He hated he didn't get to grow up with him. Hopefully in another universe he did. Okay, today you'll be doing partnered spars. You'll need to work well with your teammate to take down the opposing team. I have already chosen the teams, so no asking if you can pick them. A series of disgruntled ahs could be heard from the students, and Izuku almost snorted. The first group will be Todoroki and Kirishima versus Bakugo and Shoji. Izuku nodded to Katsuki as the blonde headed inside. A screen, which Izuku hadn't noticed, turned on to display the inside of the training facility as the fight started. The fight, Izuku thought, was a disaster for a multitude of reasons. From the moment that the exercise started, Todoroki and Katsuki were at each other's throats, completely ignoring their teammates. Kirishima and Shoji started sparring and tried covering their teammates' back, but it wasn't at all what Aizawa meant when he said fighting in teams. When the round was over, Shoji and a very forced Todoroki came over to be healed as Aizawa addressed the class. Izuku was half paying attention to the teacher, focusing on the burn mark on Shoji's right forearm. Some of the material had melted into the skin, so Izuku was currently having to pick the fabric out with a pair of tweezers. When everything was out of the way so it could be healed, Aizawa called on him. Midoriya, can you explain your thoughts on the battle? Izuku furrowed his eyebrows as he began healing Shoji. Why? He questioned, following the burn mark from the inside to the out in a spiral motion. He technically didn't need to get the worst healed before everything else, but he's found it helps the patient be less tender. You were the league's analyst. I'm curious as to what you think on their exercise. Izuku rolled his eyes as he finished up healing Shoji. He pulled out a compression sleeve, one of the multiple he had in his medkit, and handed it to the tall boy. Here, wear this over where I healed you. The new skin my quirk had your body generate from the wood will be tender, so wear this for the next couple of days. Otherwise, you're all set. Shoji nodded and took the compression sleeve. When he got up, he called Todoroki over before answering the teacher. I have a lot of thoughts on it. For example, neither Todoroki or Bakugo worked with their teammate. Instead, they let their rivalry lead the exercise. Despite this, Kirishima and Shoji ran in to fight each other in an attempt to have their teammates back. As Izuku spoke, he looked over the large gash. Though it wasn't deep enough to warrant stitches, it was bleeding a lot, so Izuku pressed a cloth to it before attempting to heal it. On top of that, they weren't aware of each other. Bakugo and Kirishima managed to hurt their own teammates. Had they been working together during the exercise, this could have been avoided. The bleeding from the wound slowed and Izuku started to clean it. This is going to sting, be prepared, he murmured to Todoroki, who he felt stiffen as the rubbing alcohol touched his skin. They failed to understand that when they are pros, fights aren't going to be one-on-one constantly, especially if any go underground, where most of the time they will be working by themselves, meaning they may be again 4 other opponents at a time. Spotlights work with each other constantly, where they'll be swapping our opponents and using their knowledge on each other to take down the criminal. After Izuku cleaned the wound, he began to heal it, pressing his hand following the gash. All very good points, Aizawa started, to which Izuku looked at him. I wasn't done. Aizawa's eyebrows raised before giving a small nod, encouraging Izuku to continue. On top of not working together, being unaware of their teammates in general, and a lack of reality check, a student wasn't giving it his all. Todoroki stiffed under him. At least he's aware of it, Izuku thought. If he wants any chance of being the best hero he can be, he'll need to get through whatever is holding him back. Izuku wrapped the gash on Todoroki's shoulder with a bandage. Keep the bandage on to help with the tenderness. Todoroki nodded stiffly and got up to join his classmates. Izuku made eye contact with the class now. He needs to understand that as a pro, if you don't give it your all constantly, you risk your life and everyone else's around you. Izuku leaned back in his chair. If they all had worked with their teammates and put in their all, what could have happened was Kirishima would have taken Bakugo on, as his quirk can prevent too much damage from Bakugo's explosion. Todoroki would have taken Shoji, as their similar height could have helped with the force needed to take him down or at least weaken him. Then they'd switch. Todoroki could have used his ice to get Bakugo less sweaty, rendering his quirk incapacitated until he worked up a sweat. Izuku looked over at Aizawa again. Or, Bakugo could have sent Shoji on Kirishima to overpower him, and Bakugo would have taken Todoroki to get him to overexert himself, make him border on hyperthermia considering his quirk, and then they would have switched, taking the final blow and their way to victory. Izuku finished, reaching for the gummies he'd taken from Recovery Girl's office. Now I'm done, he said as he popped a gummy into his mouth. Aizawa nodded approvingly. All very great points, couldn't have said it better myself. Aizawa looked down at the list he had. Okay, next round we have Uraraka and Ajuru versus Ida and Yaoyorozu. Izuku rested his head on his arms as he waited for the next round to start. Hopefully, they'd remember his lecture on the previous teams. Only one way to find out, he thought as the teams entered the arena.